Hi, this is Ed Breniger, Circle of Impact Leadership, and this webinar is the story we tell ourselves in times of uncertainty. And that is where we are right now. Everything is uncertain, health-wise, financially, socially. In many ways, this is an unprecedented experience that many of us are experiencing. And so this webinar is intended to do one thing in particular. It is to root you in a story that reminds you of who you are and gives you strength and self-confidence and perspective and a place to root your life as we go through all the changes that will come because of this coronavirus that we are experiencing. So for the next 30 minutes, we will be talking about this idea that there is a story that we carry with us. And we walk into a situation that is filled with conflict, filled with uncertainty, and we tell this story to ourselves so that we don't get lost in the fear, and get lost in the self-doubt, get lost in the confusion, get lost in all the negative messages and fear-based messages that continue to be sent our way. I came to this idea in reflecting upon my own childhood, and this is how I think of a story. A story is, there's stories that have a beginning and end and a middle, and they have a crescendo and all these things. And there are a lot of people who write about stories. So I think that is a great thing, but I'm not talking about writing a complete story. Instead, I'm talking about remembering events or vignettes from our life that are stories of moments in time that were significant to us. And let me give you an example of one. When I was probably 11 or 12, my grandmother said something to me that has stayed with me all my life. And actually, it was one of those transformational moments that don't come very often. And I don't know why she said this. I know she didn't say this to my sisters, and she didn't say it to any of my cousins, but she said it to me. And what she said was, "You can do anything you want, but just do not bring shame to the family name." Wow, what an interesting thing to say to a young man, not even an adolescent yet. And yet I remember that, and I remember the moment, and I remember how impactful it was on me. Because what it did was it released me from some obligation to follow someone's predictable path for me. My grandfather was a lawyer. I didn't follow in his practice of law. I didn't do what my father did, which was to go into human resource management in a corporation. I didn't do what anyone else I know has done in quite the same way that I have done it. So my grandmother releasing me gave me a sense of personhood, a sense of who I was, that enabled me to say, okay, I'm going to be a curious, adventuresome person all my life. And that is what has happened. And that impact of 11 or 12 years old has had an impact upon me every year, every month, every week ever since, to the point where, for example, I decided last fall to respond positively to invitations to go to Africa to do leadership training. And the experience of doing leadership training in Africa has now become part of my story. And I am grateful for that, because now my story takes on a bit more shape and form than simply what my grandmother said. And of course, every year of my life, there's events which have both validated my grandmother's comment and also motivated me to go do things that I wouldn't have done otherwise. What I'm saying to you is that you have had experiences like this And some of them may have been hard experiences, and some of them may be positive experiences. Whichever they may be, these form part of the story that you tell yourself. Now, I turned this idea of the story into actually a product or a program that I could use. Several years ago, I got invited to become one of the trainers for a organization that worked with women who were in addiction recovery. And these women all lived in a house together, 10 women in a house. And my job, my volunteer job, was to come over for an hour a week and do life skills training. And in the way I had pitched it to them, I said, what we want to do is make sure that they're prepared when they leave here to manage the challenges of living in the world as it exists today. And from that, I developed this idea of having a story that we tell ourselves. Let me tell you about one of these women. When she decided to change her life, she had her 2 children, one being an infant, and she was living in an abandoned house. All the windows had been broken out. There was no electricity, there was no water, no heat. And at some point in time, she decided, I can no longer do this. So she reached out to her parents. Her parents reached out to the social services office in their community, and an arrangement was made so that she could have her children distributed to members of her family for care. And then she went into this program to deal with her drug and alcohol addiction. So I asked her, what was that moment in time when you made the decision that I'm no longer going to live the way I've been living? And she told me, she says, it was because I looked at my children and I realized I didn't want them to have to live this way any longer. And so I responded to that and I said, so the thing which was the motivation for you was your love for your children, not your own desire to change yourself, but actually it was your love for your children. And she said, yes. So here in that story is this young woman who was having a really difficult life, disastrous, horrible life. And yet there was a story still embedded in her about her children that gave her the motivation and the impetus to take the initiative to make the call so that she could change her life. And it has made a difference ever since. I'm suggesting to you that there is this type of story in you that is like that now. And you may be overwhelmed by fear, and you have a sense of panic about the coronavirus. You're afraid that you might get sick, or maybe you and your family are afraid that you might lose your job, or maybe you've already lost your job and you're afraid of how you're going to pay your bills here on out. So whatever that is, there's something inside of you, I'm convinced of, that if you were to tap into, that would become a source of strength for you to face the challenges that you have today. So how do we find what those stories are, those little vignettes that provide us a way to understand who we are in the moment of uncertainty? Well, one way is to look back in your lifetime and say, what were the moments that I felt the most secure, or the moments I felt the most relaxed or at peace or most excited about who I was? And maybe this was as a child, or maybe it was sometime after you were in college, or maybe it has something to do with the work that you're doing now, because you're having an impact on some people and now you're not there with them because you're all sheltering in place. And so you're at home, and it's a little difficult because, in a sense, maybe you don't really like being alone by yourself. Whatever it may be, there's something within you which is a story that you can tell yourself to remind yourself of who you are and what you can do. So let's look at this story this way. So we have a story but it's made up of parts. It's not a complete story. It's not taking like a novel off of a shelf and it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. No, this story, our story, is made up of parts. And some of those parts are experience. Like with my grandmother, that was an experience. And there were, and from that experience, there was what I'm going to call a value, a sense of value that I received from her, which says she loved me and she cares for me and she wants the best for me, but she's also going to give me some advice, some direction. So that's my story. But there's also a way to talk about these as values, things that are important to you. And the way to connect with what those values are is to think about what is it that you're willing to sacrifice for? And I know a lot of people who are willing to sacrifice to delay gratification, to work hard, to get their education, to get their credentials, to get their certification, to get their experience, to get their internship, to get all those things out of the way so that they may become successful in the work that they do. That's a form of sacrifice. And it's an investment in the future when we are willing to do the work, go to school, do the training, do all those things in order to advance ourselves so that we can be in a position of strength and a place where we can make a difference that matters in the world. But there's another way of talking about these values. And they're the things which say, which describe who we are. And let me give you an example. In my book, Circle of Impact, Taking Personal Initiative to Ignite Change, there's a story in here near the end about a man that I met in Afghanistan. There he is. And I was part of a team of volunteers doing refugee work in 1981. And these were Afghan refugees fleeing the Soviet Union military who had invaded their country. And they had come to this desert plain outside of Peshawar, Pakistan, and they had set up a camp. And we came into their camp to see how we could help. And what we wanted to do was provide them food and maybe new tents and some clothing. And we had accomplished that. And we were preparing to leave to go back into town, having done our work for the day. And that man, that picture that I showed you, he came over to me and he took my hands in his hands and shook them. Then he reached up and he stroked my beard. And here I am, a young 27-year-old kid from America, and this is a very unusual thing. Later, Gordon, who was our host, told me that what he had done was to show how one Afghan man shows another Afghan man honor. And when he said that to me, it was very significant to me because no one had ever shown me honor before. And here this poor man, this poor Afghan man who was he was trying to make sure that he could take care of his family and his community. And here he comes and he shows me honor and gives me thanks for what we had done. And it touched me deeply. And it became one of those experiences which changed my life and is now defines the values that I use in everything that I do. And that is the value of honor and the value of gratitude. And he showed me both of those in that simple moment of about a minute and a half. But that moment changed my life. And the work that I do now is the product of what he does. And so in many respects, I'm doing this video in honor of what he gave to me. I am certain that there are situations that are in your life where you have found that there were certain things that you value, that you could put down as a word or a few phrases to describe the values that are important to you. And the way I look at this is I look at this as as something which is non-negotiable. I'm going to be honorable, for example, I'm going to be honorable and grateful regardless of what I go through, regardless of the hardships that I face, regardless of how people treat me. I'm going to be an honorable person, because that is a core value of my life. And that is, I believe, exactly what my grandmother was trying to teach me. You may do whatever you want, but never forget to be an honorable person. And so that's who I am. That's my story. I am suggesting that there are values in your life which are like this. And maybe it's family, or maybe it is creativity, or maybe it's integrity, some kind of word or a collection of words which define you. And so when you are challenged to be fearful, and when you are challenged to give up, you turn to those things and say, I am not going to do that because I must give up this value that is important to me. And so it's important to be able to define what that is. And one way we can get to that is to understand what our purpose is. So my purpose, if I could put it this way, has come out of this, which is to help people, which is to inspire and equip people to create impact. That is my purpose. And so the result of this video, I pray and hope, I suggest, is that you will find something in yourself which will move you into action so that your values will have a representation in your actions. They're just not things that are in your mind or something that you feel strongly about, but it's something that gives you a framework for how you're going to act in the world. And so maybe your value is that of caring or love. And so what you need in this time of coronavirus crisis is to find a way to express love to people in a very tangible way so that it might have an effect upon them. And if love is your value, then I would suggest that you ask the question, so if I love someone, what is the impact that I want to see coming from that love? So that's the way these values come at us. They not only inform us in terms of who we see ourselves to be, but it also informs how we want to live our lives, what our purpose is. And I would call that our purpose for impact. So we have a purpose for impact. And when everything seems uncertain and everything seems to be confusing and everything seems so fluid so that from day to day, you don't know what to think and what to do, being able to focus on, okay, what is the difference I can make today? Who is it that I can call? Who is it that I can send a note to? Who is it that I can do things for in order for me to make a difference to them in their life? Because if you are giving yourself in service to someone or some group or some cause, when you're also in the midst of a challenging, uncertain time, what you are saying to the world is that I have figured out how to be myself, be the strongest, best person that I can be, even when everything around me seems to be falling apart. See, this is why we have a story. This is the story that guides us and reminds us. So let me tell you one more way of seeing this story, because it's also a protective device. So in working with these young women who were in addiction recovery, I framed this story as a way of saying, this is how you stay out of trouble, because they had all been in trouble, not just in kind of the moral sense of trouble, but also had been in trouble with the authorities. So I said, here's your story. And this is the story you need to create for yourself that is a protection for what might happen in the future. So I said, here's something. So now you finish the program and you go work, and you're in an office and you're working with a group of women, and they say, well, let's go to dinner together. And so you all get into the car and you go to dinner together. But what you realize as you're driving into the parking lot is that you're going to a bar that has food. And you're committed not to being an alcoholic anymore. You're committed to spending every day being faithful to your commitment not to drink and not to stay sober. So what do you do? What do you do if you're sitting in the back seat of that car and you're driving up to this bar? And how do you prepare yourself to deal with the challenge of that moment? Well, you have a story that you tell them and say, listen, I know this is something we want to do, but I can't go in there. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to call my other friend, and she'll come pick me up and she'll take me home. And then thank you. And I'll see you at work tomorrow. So she has a story prepared for the eventuality of a very conflicted situation. Most of us have not prepared ourselves for the coronavirus crisis. None of us, I don't know anyone that prepared for this pandemic, and I don't know anyone who's really prepared for the social and economic fallout that comes from this. So we're all faced with very challenging moments. And so if you're not prepared, then what you have to do is to begin today. There's an old saying is, when's the best time to plant a tree for shade? 30 years ago. When's the second best time to plant a tree for shade? Today. Well, if you have not prepared for the future, then today is the time to begin to prepare for the future. And by having a story that we tell ourselves is a way of getting at that. I want to tell one more story to get at what we're seeing here. And this story comes from my book, Circle of Impact. And if you've read this book, you know the story of Brian. And Brian was a professional athlete in his city, and he retired, and then he went to become the executive director of a very prominent sports nonprofit in the city. And what no one expected was that when he was hired, that he would be treated with resistance by the staff. So let me read a portion of this from the book. As often happens, the best intentions of a board for the future of its organization can conflict with the current reality of the organization. Almost immediately, Brian faced resistance to his leadership from staff members. They viewed the board's new vision with skepticism, believing that they knew better where the organization needed to grow. Resistance to Brian's presence came in two separate actions. The first act of resistance came from withholding critical information about programs. The second, more significant action came as two of the senior level staff went directly to board members whom they had counted as friends and supporters to make the case for Brian's removal. Can you imagine something like that happening in an organization where you work? They were turned back and told that they were out of line. Both actions were clearly politically motivated. Brian was not a neophyte executive. He had owned his own sports marketing business while playing as a professional. When he retired from playing, he sold his business. The transparent nature of the staff's resistance to his leadership was immediately evident. And so Brian entered into this job with a story about who he was. And this is what I want you to hear. It's because it's not just that we individually need a story to tell ourselves, but our companies and our communities And our families also need a story that we tell ourselves so that we can deal with change and we can deal with uncertainty in a very strong and effective way. In dealing with these two acts of insubordination, Brian knew that how he responded would set the tone and direction for the organization going forward. In relationship to the first action of withholding information, he met with the staff responsible for this resistance. He told them that they had a choice: act with integrity or resign. He gave them a week to provide him the information that he had requested. They had agreed to do so as he asked. The situation with the two senior staff who sought his dismissal was more serious and a delicate one. After discussion with the board, Brian terminated the two staff members. Imagine you're brand new and you're firing two of the senior staff members of the organization. That requires a level of confidence that you know who you are, you know what's important, and you're willing to put it all on the line. You're willing to sacrifice so that the values that you're bringing to the situation may be upheld. The following morning, he gathered the remaining staff to inform them of his actions. One person after another came to him afterwards to thank him. You see, he had a story that he didn't know that he was also sharing with other people, that they shared the same thing with him. So here he is building a team without really knowing that that's what he was doing, but that was his intention. When he asked why they thanked him, each responded in the same way. Those two have been trying to run our lives for a long time. Brian was not blindsided by these actions. His long athletic career had taught him the importance of what it took to create a winning, high-performing team. His purpose was to create a winning, high-performing team. He had seen in his interactions with the nonprofit staff during the interview process that they were not a team, but a collection of individuals doing the jobs that they were hired to do. Brian looked at the organization through the lens of teamwork. For him, the four connecting ideas were essential ingredients in creating a team that could reach beyond its own perceived limitations. And so the four connecting ideas are values, purpose, vision, and impact. In meeting with his staff, and I'll finish with this, Brian told them this: I was hired to do a specific job. I was not hired to do your jobs. We need each of you to do what you were hired to do in the very best possible way. I freely admit that I don't know how you do what you do. I do know why you do it. You care about the people who benefit from our programs. As long as you are honest, give your best, and put our people first, then I'll be your greatest champion. And I hope in time you'll become mine. You see, this idea of having a story which guides us and informs us how we're going to perform in our lives and how we deal with uncertainty and difficulties is not just a little idea out there. I think it's one of the essential ideas that we need to wrap our heads around so that we can find self-confidence, remove self-doubt, that we can find who we actually are, and that we can begin to say, you know, my life can be different and better even in the midst of this crisis that we're going through. And this is true not just for you as an individual, it's also true for your businesses and your staff. So here's what I'd like to propose to you, because I think this is a moment in time. This is a moment that we're not going to get again. This is a moment where everyone is sensitive, everyone is alert, everyone is aware that something is not right and something needs to change. And so let me suggest to you that you and I, or me and you and your team at your business, begin to work on how you have a story that you can tell that carries you through the challenges of these next months and years. And that story that we create for you has everything to do with the experience that you want to have, and has everything to do with the values that you believe in, and it has everything to do of how you define the purpose for impact that you are to have as a person and as a company. So let me encourage you to reach out to me. Email me at ed@edbreniger.com. You can see it in the notes below. And let's begin to have a conversation about how we might do this. I don't expect it to happen overnight, but I also don't expect it to take forever to do. And I don't expect it to be so expensive that it requires you to sacrifice other things. I think there's a way for us to work together so that we can find a way that you can survive this moment in time, and maybe even find a way to support your staff in ways that maybe you haven't found a way to do that. And it all comes back to knowing who you are, knowing what your purpose is, and knowing how that purpose is really a reflection of the values that are important to you. So this is Ed Breniger. Reach out to me at ed@edbreniger.com. And I look forward to having a conversation with you and look forward to working with you, because this is the moment of opportunity that we have. And 6 months from now, we won't have this opportunity. It'll be very different. So while we're all kind of sequestered in our homes, this is the time to go to work, and I'm ready to do so with you. So thank you for watching this webinar. There'll be more to come in the few weeks, and I look forward to seeing you then. And thank you very much. Bye.